Sergeant Leah Matthews leaned back into the worn seat of the airport lounge, every inch of her body aching with exhaustion. She had returned from her third deployment, a grueling 9-month tour in a remote outpost halfway across the world. She tried to breathe, to relax, to feel some sense of home, but instead, she was met with the odd sensation that had become all too familiar, this disconnection from civilian life, the way everything seemed normal and yet somehow wasn't. The bright, bustling atmosphere around her felt surreal, almost jarring after the rigid monotony of life on base. She was drained, more than just tired in body. Leah felt it deep in her bones, in a place that ran deeper than any physical weariness. She thought of the early morning spent waking up in cold barracks, her boots laced up tightly and helmet heavy on her head. For nearly a year, her daily routines had been soaked in sweat, heat, and the ever-present fear of danger that lurked beyond the chain-link fences of her camp. Life on deployment was defined by vigilance. Every morning, she would wake with the knowledge that each day was unpredictable, that each day held risks she had no control over. Despite the weight of her fatigue, she still felt the satisfaction of having served. Leah was proud of her role, proud to wear the uniform and stand among those who had risked their lives to protect the rights and freedoms of others. She felt a strength in that pride, knowing she had chosen a path that demanded everything from her physically, mentally, and emotionally. But the sacrifices had been severe, and that strength hadn't shielded her from the moments when the cost of that choice felt almost too heavy to bear. For Leah, the sacrifices had often been layered. As an African American woman in the military, she had endured her fair share of challenges and discrimination, even within the ranks. She was proud of the respect she had earned, but it had been hard-won through determination, grit, and more restraint than she'd cared to admit. There had been whispers, sideways glances, assumptions about her capabilities. Some people had expected her to be soft, while others had seemed to doubt she belonged in uniform at all, but she belonged. Leah had made sure of that from the start, pushing through every challenge, every setback, and every doubting look that had come her way. She'd worked twice as hard, knowing her every move might be scrutinized more closely than others. And despite the prejudice she sometimes faced, Leah had grown close to many of her fellow soldiers. They were her family now, bonded by the shared experiences that few outside of the military could understand. She had bled and sweat alongside them, fought for them, and trusted them to protect her as she protected them. Together, they had endured hardships that felt almost impossible to explain, creating a bond built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. But there were some things that no amount of service could erase. For Leah, there were those lonely moments during deployment, when she would think of home, of the freedom she was defending, and remember the inequalities that still existed within it. Her country was hers to serve, but it hadn't always served her in return. Growing up, she had faced bias that left scars even deeper than the physical ones her military training had given her. Those memories had followed her, echoing at unexpected times, like the early days in boot camp when a senior officer had pulled her aside to question her commitment to the armed forces. The conversation had been coated in barely concealed judgment, but Leah had stood her ground, knowing she would prove herself in action, not words, and she had. Now, as she sat in the airport, clutching her worn duffel bag and waiting for the announcement for her boarding gate, those memories felt even sharper. She had survived deployment, but there was a piece of her that was still wounded, still fragile in ways she couldn't fully explain. She longed for the familiarity of her family, the faces of friends who understood her history, who knew her struggles not only as a soldier but as Leah Matthews, the young girl who'd grown up in a world that didn't always see her. Glancing around the busy terminal, Leah's gaze fell on the crowd of people, most of them absorbed in their phones or chatting with travel companions. There was an ease in their faces, a casualness she couldn't quite relate to. She wondered if they could even imagine the places she'd been, the things she'd seen, the stark landscapes, the cracked desert earth stretching for miles, the quiet of a night spent under a foreign sky, broken only by the hum of equipment and the distant sound of radio chatter. Her thoughts drifted back to those long nights, the ones that tested her resolve. She remembered the sounds that would echo in the darkness, the rhythmic thud of boots on the ground, the hum of engines idling nearby, the occasional bursts of laughter that would rise above the quiet, breaking the tension for just a moment. Those nights had forged her, transforming her into someone who could find strength even in the most vulnerable of moments. Yet here she was, back home, feeling somehow less certain. Her body was home, but her mind was scattered, still caught between worlds. As much as she loved her country, she was tired of always having to prove herself, both as a soldier and as a black woman in America. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. The uniform might command respect, but beneath it, she was often still met with suspicion or judgment. It was a strange kind of isolation, one that followed her everywhere, even here, in the place she had fought so hard to protect. As her flight number echoed over the intercom, Leah stood, rolling her shoulders and adjusting the strap of her duffel. She took a breath, reminding herself that each step forward brought her closer to home. This trip felt like a journey back to a life she had left behind, but it also felt like a reminder of the uncharted territory that lay ahead. What did it mean to come home when the battles she fought were no longer just about her uniform or the flag, but about who she was underneath it all? Leah moved toward the gate, the crowd parting as she made her way forward. There was a mixture of pride and weariness in her posture, the weight of her experiences adding depth to her every step. She wondered if anyone could see it, the strength that she carried within her, the story etched in her weary gaze. But perhaps it didn't matter. She knew who she was, and she knew what she had endured. And in a way, that was enough. The boarding line moved slowly, inching forward, and she clutched her ticket, the one tangible link to a place she could finally call her own. As Leah boarded the plane, a wave of fatigue washed over her, but she was also carrying a quiet excitement she hadn't felt in a while. Her fingers tightened around her ticket, and she glanced down to see the words, "First Class, Seat 3A." The small note beside her name, a government-issued upgrade, was unmistakable. This small gesture caught her off guard. She had heard that the military sometimes offered perks like these to soldiers returning from active duty, but she'd never expected it to happen to her. For a moment, Leah felt a thrill, something pure and almost childlike. She had spent the last 9 months sleeping on a thin cot, her quarters cramped and shared with 5 other women. Privacy, let alone luxury, had been a foreign concept. The idea of settling into a plush, wide seat, with extra legroom and amenities, felt almost surreal. The scent of fresh coffee and the faint waft of something sweet hit her as she walked into the first-class cabin. She could feel a small smile tug at the corner of her lips. As she approached her seat, her eyes lingered on the rows around her, where passengers were already settling in, most of them dressed in business attire or clothes that suggested wealth. Leah straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her uniform, and reminded herself she had earned this moment. She tried to hold on to that surge of confidence as she tucked her bag into the compartment above her seat and lowered herself into the wide, cushioned chair, but that thrill was short-lived. She could feel it, an invisible ripple passing through the cabin. The subtle, sideway glances. Some passengers were quick to look away when her gaze met theirs, but others didn't bother to hide their curiosity or discomfort. Leah felt the eyes linger on her. She didn't know if it was the uniform, her skin color, or perhaps both that made her seem out of place in the eyes of those around her. The ease she had felt moments ago dissipated, leaving behind the ever-present unease that came with navigating spaces where she was seen but not welcomed. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him, a man seated to her right, in the aisle seat of her row. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and a crisp navy blue suit that looked like it had never seen a day out of first class. His posture was stiff, his gaze locked forward, but she could sense his discomfort. Every few seconds, he would shift in his seat, casting brief glances her way before looking off again. There was an air of restrained judgment about him, something tense and unspoken that hung in the space between them. Leah tried to ignore it. She reminded herself that she'd dealt with worse. She had faced the scrutiny of her superiors, the skepticism of fellow soldiers, and the weight of her own self-doubt in the years it had taken to rise through the ranks. This man's discomfort, his quiet disapproval, was nothing compared to what she had already endured. She leaned back, determined to enjoy the luxury, to close her eyes and allow herself a moment of peace, but then, she heard it, a muttered phrase, barely audible but unmistakable. "First class isn't what it used to be." It was a single, cutting line, muttered just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to carry the shield of deniability. Leah's eyes opened, and she turned her head slightly, catching the man's side profile as he stared intently at the seat in front of him, his face tense, lips pressed into a thin line. She took a slow breath, her fingers curling into fists in her lap as she processed his words. It wasn't the first time she had heard a remark like that, but it stung all the same. She knew exactly what he was implying, the invisible line he was drawing between himself and someone like her. Her heartbeat quickened as a mix of anger and hurt bubbled up inside her. She wanted to respond, to make him see her as more than the uniform or the color of her skin. But she had learned over the years that confrontation wasn't always the answer, that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Yet, the restraint was difficult. She was already on edge from her recent return, from the exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow. This was supposed to be her moment to breathe, to relax, to enjoy a small slice of comfort, and here he was, quietly spoiling that. Leah's thoughts drifted, memories flashing in her mind's eye. She thought of the countless moments in her life where she had been forced to go through this unspoken hostility. The times in school when teachers had expected less of her. And here, once again, was another reminder that in some people's eyes, she would never truly belong. Not even in her own country. Not even as someone who had chosen to risk her life to protect it. She glanced down at the patch sewn onto her sleeve, the emblem of her unit, the insignia that represented her sacrifices, her dedication. She traced it with her fingers, feeling the familiar fabric, the weight of its meaning. How many times had she stood at attention, had she marched, had she trained until her muscles screamed, just to wear that patch with pride? And here, in the confined luxury of a first-class seat, she was still an outsider, still questioned in ways this man would never have to endure. Leah looked back at the man. He seemed lost in his own world, but she could feel the distance between them, a distance he had decided upon without knowing a single thing about her. And yet, she had been taught, trained, to keep her composure, to never let emotions overrule her actions. She had learned the value of restraint, of picking battles wisely. She reminded herself that she didn't need to prove anything to him. Her presence alone was a statement. Still, something within her refused to let his words go unanswered. She wanted him to understand who she was, what she had endured, and what it truly meant to sit here, in this seat, after all she had faced. She deserved this place as much as anyone. She knew it, but part of her wondered if saying nothing would be enough. How many more times would she have to sit in silence, allowing the unspoken judgments to wash over her? And so, she waited, her mind swirling with emotions, anger, hurt, determination. She thought of her family back home, the pride in their voices whenever they spoke of her. Her mother had always taught her to hold her head high, to stand firm against prejudice, but she had also taught her the power of words, of measured responses. Leah could almost hear her mother's voice in her mind, reminding her that sometimes the most impactful statements were those that forced others to confront their own biases, to see their own flaws reflected back at them. As the plane continued to fill and the flight attendants moved through the aisles, Leah's resolve hardened. She was going to respond, but she was going to do it on her own terms. She would find a way to speak to this man, to make him see her as a human being, as someone who had earned her place, not just in first class, but in this world. Her decision made, Leah felt a wave of calm settle over her. She adjusted in her seat, catching the man's eye for a fleeting second as he shifted uncomfortably beside her. She didn't flinch, didn't break her gaze. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a silent message she hoped he would understand. She wouldn't let his assumptions define her. Not now, not ever. Leah leaned back, letting herself relax, if only for a moment, as she began to form her response. A response that would come not through confrontation, but through a choice to make herself known. Her history, her sacrifices, her pride in her identity in service. Her mind turned to the idea of responding in a way that might challenge his assumptions without escalating the situation. She didn't want to argue, she wanted him to understand. She wanted to reach him, to plant a seed of doubt in the certainty he seemed to have about people like her. Slowly, an idea began to form in her mind. She would write him a note, a letter that would express her thoughts without confrontation. A letter that would give him a glimpse into her life, her experiences, her truth. Taking a deep breath, Leah reached into her bag and pulled out a small notepad and pen. She hesitated for a moment, her hand poised over the paper, and then she began to write. Her words flowed from a place deep within her, a place that held both her pride and her pain. She wanted this man to understand the person sitting beside him, not as an object of judgment, but as a human being with a story worth knowing. As she wrote, she thought back to the many sacrifices she had made, the moments when she had put her life on the line, not for recognition or reward, but because she believed in something larger than herself. She believed in the ideals her country stood for, even if they hadn't always been extended to her. She had chosen to serve because she believed that change was possible, that through her actions, she could contribute to a better world. And even in the face of prejudice, she had held on to that belief, choosing kindness over resentment, patience over anger. In her note, Leah decided to start with something simple yet profound, her pride in serving her country. She wrote about the sense of duty that had driven her to join the military, the honor she felt in defending the rights and freedoms of others. She wanted him to understand that, for her, service was not just a job, it was a calling, a purpose that gave her life meaning. She wrote about the struggles she had faced, both within and outside the military, the moments when her strength had been questioned, her resolve doubted. She wanted him to see her resilience, her determination to rise above the challenges, to prove her worth, not through words, but through her actions. But Leah didn't stop there. She went deeper, letting her words reveal the pain she had carried, the quiet hurt that came from knowing she would always be seen as different, as somehow less worthy, because of the color of her skin. She wrote about the looks she received, the silent judgments that followed her even in uniform, as if her service, her sacrifices, somehow counted for less. She wrote about the people who had doubted her, who had assumed she didn't belong, not because of her actions, but because of who she was. And yet, despite it all, Leah had chosen to continue serving. She wrote about the strength it took to carry that weight, to stand tall in the face of prejudice, to find pride in a world that often tried to deny her worth. She wanted this man to understand that her journey had been anything but easy, that she had earned her place through hard work, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to her ideals. As Leah finished writing, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The anger that had bubbled within her had softened, replaced by a quiet determination. She read over the words, feeling the weight of her story on the page, and she hoped. Hoped that he would read it with an open heart, that he would see her, truly see her, beyond his assumptions. Gently, Leah folded the note and turned to the man beside her. He glanced at her, his expression wary, as if bracing for a confrontation. But Leah simply extended the note, her gaze steady, her hand calm. "Would you mind reading this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated, his eyes flickering between her face and the note in her hand. There was a moment of silence, a charged pause where time seemed to stand still, and then, reluctantly, he took the note from her. She sensed his surprise as he unfolded the note, his hesitation evident in the slight pause before he brought the paper closer to read. Leah's mind drifted back to the words she had chosen so carefully, each one crafted to capture the truth she carried, the strength she had earned, and the pain she had swallowed time and time again. As he read, Leah found herself reliving the stories embedded in that letter. She had poured a piece of herself onto the page, and now, through his guarded glances and the rigidity of his shoulders, she could see him grappling with what lay before him. She had opened with a straightforward message. "Thank you for reading this. My name is Sergeant Leah Matthews, and I've just returned from my third deployment." The words had come out simply, with no hint of the pride or exhaustion that lay beneath them, but she hoped that somewhere in that plain statement, he would feel a fraction of what it truly meant. It was not just a title or a rank, not just a name. It was her identity, a part of her life that had defined every waking moment for the past decade. She wanted him to know that she wasn't just another passenger, not a nameless figure to be dismissed. From there, she had written about her pride in her uniform, her love for her country, and the sacrifices that had become woven into the fabric of her being. I joined the military because I believe in the ideals of freedom, of equality, of dignity for every person, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. I believe in defending those values, even if the world doesn't always extend them to me. The words were honest, raw, and layered with the kind of vulnerability Leah rarely allowed herself to show. She wanted him to understand that her choice to serve was not out of blind patriotism, nor a sense of obligation. It was a commitment, a deeply personal vow to protect a country that, despite its flaws, had the potential for greatness. But even as she defended these ideals, she had been reminded over and over of the barriers that still existed. Those barriers had shaped her, leaving marks that were invisible but no less real than the scars she bore from combat. She continued, drawing him into her experiences, into the life that existed behind her polished uniform and stoic expression. This uniform might look like a shield, but it doesn't protect me from everything. I've faced scrutiny and judgment, both as a soldier and as a black woman. I'm used to people questioning my place, doubting my capabilities without knowing anything about who I am. Those words held a quiet pain, a sadness that she had learned to carry in silence. Leah had chosen to address the reality of her experiences openly, not to confront him, but to make him see her humanity. Her fingers had lingered over that line as she wrote it, wondering if he would understand the weight of what it meant to be judged not for one's actions but for something as unchangeable as the color of her skin. Leah had gone further, peeling back more layers, sharing moments that had defined her, that had forced her to confront the world with resilience and dignity. In my years of service, I've slept on hard floors, kept watch through long, cold nights, and faced challenges that most people will never know. I've trained side by side with men and women who, like me, were willing to put their lives on the line. But unlike them, I've often felt the need to prove that I belonged. She thought of the countless days when her strength had been tested, not just in combat but in the quieter, more insidious ways. There had been officers who had looked at her with skepticism, who had expected her to be weaker, to fail. And each time, Leah had risen to the challenge, driven not by anger but by a determination to defy those expectations. She wanted him to feel that journey, to understand the courage it took not only to face external threats but to push through the subtle, daily trials that were invisible to those who hadn't walked her path. Leah's words had grown more personal, revealing parts of herself she had rarely shared. I am proud of what I have accomplished. I've seen my peers, those I've fought beside, come to respect me, to see my strength beyond what's visible. Yet, every time I return home, I am reminded that there are people who still see me as an outsider. That line had stung as she wrote it. It was a truth she had carried for as long as she could remember. No matter how far she went, how much she achieved, there was always a reminder that to some, she would always be different, always be something separate from what they considered the norm. It was a quiet pain, one that lived in the sidelong glances, the whispers, the subtle ways in which people let her know she didn't fit into their preconceived world, but her words didn't end on a note of resentment. She had chosen to extend her letter with a quiet but firm message of dignity, a belief in kindness over division. I don't expect you to understand my life fully, nor do I hold any bitterness toward you. I simply ask that you see me as I am, a person who has dedicated herself to something larger, someone who believes in the good this country can offer, and who serves with honor, even if that respect is not always returned. In those words, she had poured the essence of who she was, a person shaped by her experiences but not hardened by them. She wanted him to feel that message, to see that despite everything, she held no hatred, no anger, only a quiet resolve to live with integrity. Leah had chosen to share her story with him, not to change his mind, but to offer a glimpse into the life he had judged so quickly. Her story was not meant to confront but to soften, to reach through the barriers of prejudice with a simple plea for understanding. The letter concluded with a single line, simple yet heavy with meaning: "Thank you for reading this. I hope this will help you to see me as I am, as someone who has earned her place." As the man beside her read her words, Leah felt a strange calm settle over her. She didn't know how he would respond, whether he would feel guilt, shame, or perhaps nothing at all. But she knew she had spoken her truth, that she had offered him a part of herself that was real, unfiltered, and deeply personal. She hadn't hidden behind anger or bitterness, she had chosen to meet his judgment with honesty and grace. The man's hands trembled slightly as he held the note, his expression a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and something else Leah couldn't quite identify. He read her words slowly, his eyes moving down the page with a hesitant reverence. Leah kept her gaze forward, not wanting to intrude on his moment of reflection, yet feeling every beat of tension between them. When he finally finished, he sat there, the silence stretching thick and charged. Leah could feel his presence beside her, a heavy shift in the air that suggested he was grappling with what he had read. Part of her wanted to ask him what he thought, but she held herself back, letting him come to his own conclusions, letting him sit with the words she had written. After a moment, he turned to her, his eyes softer, his expression less rigid than before. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the letter had stripped away the layers of prejudice that had clouded his vision. For a second, he opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed to escape him. Instead, he cleared his throat, his gaze falling back to the note as if he were absorbing its message all over again. David stared down at the folded note in his lap, his fingers tracing the creases in the paper as if it held something fragile, something that had to be handled with care. The words were still swirling in his mind, their weight pressing down on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He felt exposed, as though Leah's letter had peeled back a layer he'd kept hidden even from himself. He wasn't accustomed to this feeling, this quiet, simmering sense of self-doubt that twisted in his chest. He shifted in his seat, aware of Leah's presence beside him, and the deep shame that was slowly creeping over him. How quickly he'd made his assumptions, how easily he'd cast judgment, letting a single glance form his entire opinion. He hadn't known anything about her struggles, her sacrifices, or the quiet pride that was woven into each line she'd written. Yet he had decided, in a moment, that she didn't belong here. David let out a small, shaky breath. The words from Leah's note played over in his mind, each line touching a part of him that he hadn't examined in a long time. This uniform might look like a shield, but it doesn't protect me from everything. I've faced scrutiny and judgment, both as a soldier and as a black woman. I'm used to people questioning my place, doubting my capabilities without knowing anything about who I am. Those words had struck him, unraveling the tightly woven assumptions he had held. Leah had laid bare the silent, relentless battles she fought daily, battles he couldn't begin to comprehend. She hadn't merely described her life, she had offered him a glimpse into the emotional scars, the burden of always being judged before she could prove herself. The letter was more than just words, it was a quiet cry for understanding, a reminder of her humanity in a world that so often denied it. David felt his own chest tighten, his own memories surfacing, though he tried to push them back. He thought of the years he'd spent as a young man pop-up working hard to rise through his career, facing obstacles and doubts, yes, but nothing close to what she described. And as he grew older, those barriers had eased. He had settled into a life where his authority was rarely questioned, where his position was never taken for granted. But Leah's words reminded him of something more personal, something that had long since faded into the background of his life. It had been years, decades really, since he'd been on the receiving end of the kind of prejudice Leah had faced her whole life. When he was young, fresh out of college and struggling to find his footing in a competitive business world, he'd been dismissed by his superiors, told he wasn't right for the job or that he lacked the polish his position demanded. Those rejections had stung, shaping him in ways he hadn't realized at the time. He'd fought to prove himself, clawed his way to the top, driven by a desire to be seen as worthy. Now, as he sat beside Leah, he felt the familiar sting of that memory, the sting of being overlooked, underestimated. But what he had faced was nothing compared to the reality Leah had endured, rejection that didn't fade over time but was relentless, that followed her, day after day. Her note had struck at a part of him he had long ignored, unearthing the subtle but real prejudices he had allowed to settle into his perspective. David sighed, his gaze slipping from the note to Leah. He saw her differently now, saw the quiet dignity in her expression, the strength she carried so effortlessly. She hadn't written the note to change his mind, to confront him, or even to challenge him outright. She had simply shared her truth, offered him a glimpse of her life with the hope that he might understand. And he did. Far more than he wanted to admit, he was beginning to understand that Leah's story wasn't just about her service, or even about her experiences in the military. It was a story about resilience, about finding strength in the face of rejection, about standing tall even when others refused to see her worth. David felt a pang of regret, a sadness that settled deep within him. He'd judged her before he knew her, dismissed her without a second thought. And for what? A belief he hadn't even questioned, an idea about standards that he had never really examined. He felt the weight of his own ignorance, a discomfort that gnawed at him, forcing him to confront the biases he had allowed to guide his actions. He stole a glance at Leah, wondering how she had the patience to deal with people like him, people who, whether they admitted it or not, held silent prejudices that affected their view of others. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat, twisted with a mixture of pride and shame. Finally, he leaned closer, his voice low and unsteady. "Sergeant Matthews." He paused, swallowing, his gaze fixed on the folded note in his lap. "I didn't know. I didn't understand." "Not really." Leah turned to him, her expression calm but watchful. She didn't say anything, allowing him the space to find his words. David took a breath, feeling the weight of her gaze, the quiet strength in her eyes that made him feel vulnerable, exposed. "I think," he began, his voice wavering, "I think I've spent my whole life seeing the world a certain way, believing things I never questioned. People like me, we don't." He stopped himself, frowning, as if struggling to find the right words. "We don't see it, do we? We don't see the way people like you are forced to prove yourselves, every day, in ways I'll never understand." David felt a lump rise in his throat, his own embarrassment mingling with a growing sense of respect for the woman beside him. "I'm sorry, Leah. I judged you before I knew anything about you. And that was wrong." Leah nodded slowly, acknowledging his apology with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady but soft. "I appreciate that." Her words were kind, forgiving, but they held a firmness that reminded David of the strength she carried. This was a woman who had faced far more than his judgment, who had weathered storms he couldn't imagine. And yet, she had chosen to respond with grace, to offer him understanding instead of anger. David felt a strange sense of relief, a quiet gratitude for the opportunity she had given him to see beyond his own assumptions. Her note, her willingness to share her story, it had opened a door he hadn't even known was closed. He looked down at the note once more, reading her words again in his mind, feeling their weight all over again. Finally, he cleared his throat, feeling the need to say more, to offer her some part of himself in return. "You know," he began, his voice softer now, "I wasn't always comfortable in my own life. There was a time when I was the one trying to prove myself. But I guess I let myself forget what that felt like." Leah's gaze softened as she listened, sensing the vulnerability in his words. David hesitated, his fingers tracing the edges of her note. "When I was younger, I didn't have much. I had to fight for every promotion, every position, trying to prove I was good enough. And once I finally got to where I wanted to be, I think I let myself get too comfortable, too certain of myself. I forgot what it feels like to be dismissed, to be judged before you even get a chance to speak. Leah nodded, understanding the subtle shift in his tone. She could see that he was grappling with his own beliefs, with the life he had built on foundations he hadn't questioned until now. His apology, though clumsy, was genuine, and she could feel the sincerity in his voice. David looked at her, his expression softened, a hint of gratitude mingling with the regret in his eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant Matthews," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thank you for opening my eyes. I think I needed it." Leah smiled, her heart warming at his words. It wasn't often that people truly listened, that they took the time to see her for who she was. In David's gaze, she could see a shift, a quiet transformation that spoke volumes. He had chosen to look beyond his assumptions, to see her as a person with a story, with a strength that went far beyond what met the eye. As the plane continued its journey, a comfortable silence settled between them, a shared understanding that had replaced the tension from earlier. David held her note in his hand, glancing at it from time to time, as if her words were a reminder of the lesson he had just learned. And for Leah, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had made a difference, that her words had reached him in a way she hadn't anticipated. The barrier between them had fallen, replaced by a newfound respect, a bridge built on honesty and understanding. David sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him as the words from Leah's note replayed in his mind. There was no going back from this moment, something fundamental within him had shifted. Leah's words had pierced through the walls he hadn't even realized he'd built around himself. Those barriers had become so familiar, so tightly woven into the fabric of his life, that he had never paused to examine them. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, her profile steady, calm. She didn't seem triumphant or vindicated, if anything, she looked peaceful. There was a sense of contentment, as though she had long since found acceptance within herself. This realization brought another wave of shame over him. She had not written the note to shame him or make him feel small, she had written it simply to be seen, to be understood. And he had, for far too long, denied others that simple human dignity. With a quiet sigh, David found himself drifting back through memories he had long kept tucked away. His childhood flashed before him in fragments, days spent in a working-class neighborhood where dreams felt distant, almost unattainable. His father, a stern man with rough hands and a no-nonsense attitude, had instilled in him the importance of hard work and the belief that respect was something to be earned, not given. David had held on to that principle his entire life, letting it shape him, guide him. And yet, somewhere along the way, it had hardened into something else, something he could barely recognize now. He could feel Leah's words working through those hardened beliefs, loosening the roots of old biases that had taken hold over time. He thought back to his early career days when he'd been younger, full of ambition, hungry for success, and eager to make something of himself. It had been a challenging road, filled with moments of doubt, times when he had felt small and inadequate, when he'd questioned his worth. Yet he had persevered, climbing the corporate ladder, eventually reaching a place of comfort, of success. But in that pursuit, David realized he had lost touch with something essential, something Leah's letter had awakened in him. The empathy he had once held for those who struggled as he had, the understanding that people came from diverse backgrounds and that their stories were as complex as his own. Over time, his ambition had turned into entitlement, and his achievements had made him blind to those who had fought just as hard, if not harder, for their own place in the world. David's thoughts drifted back to one particular memory, a moment he hadn't thought of in years. He was in his mid-20s, a few years into his career, working as an intern for a large firm in the city. It had been his first real taste of the business world, and he had felt both exhilarated and out of place. The firm was prestigious, filled with people who seemed to exude confidence, people who looked as though they had never known a day of struggle. There had been a senior partner there, a man named Harold, who had taken an instant dislike to David. Harold was quick to criticize, slow to praise, and seemed to find fault in everything David did. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling week, David had overheard Harold speaking to a colleague about him, dismissing David's potential with a harshness that had stung. "Some people just don't belong here," Harold had said, his tone dismissive, as though David were nothing more than an inconvenience. David had never forgotten that moment. He had taken those words as a challenge, a reason to push harder, to prove that he did belong, that he was capable, worthy. But as the years passed and his career advanced, David had lost touch with that young man who had once fought so hard to prove himself. Instead, he had become a version of Harold, a gatekeeper of standards, quick to judge those who didn't fit into his neatly defined view of the world. And now, sitting beside Leah, he felt the weight of that realization bearing down on him, an uncomfortable truth that refused to be ignored. He had become the very thing he had once despised. He turned to her, his expression softened by a newfound humility. "Leah," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Leah looked at him, her gaze open and patient. "Of course," she replied. David hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "How do you keep going? I mean, after everything you've been through, how do you stay so calm, so strong?" Leah's expression softened, and she seemed to take a moment to gather her thoughts. "I think," she began slowly, "it comes down to knowing who you are, really knowing yourself, even when the world tries to define you differently." She paused, as if weighing her next words. "There have been times when I felt like giving up, when the weight of it all felt too heavy to carry. But each time, I reminded myself why I chose this path. I chose it because I believe in something larger than myself. I believe in a better world, even if it's imperfect, and I believe in fighting for that world, no matter how difficult it is." Her words resonated deeply with David, stirring something within him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Leah's belief, her commitment, it was the kind of conviction he had once felt, the kind that had driven him in his younger years. He had lost that somewhere along the way, but hearing her speak, he felt a flicker of that old determination returning, a reminder of the man he had once aspired to be. "You know," Leah continued, her voice thoughtful, "there was a time when I was more confrontational, when I wanted to fight every battle, to challenge every injustice head-on. But I realized that some fights are won not through confrontation, but through persistence, through showing up every day, through proving people wrong by simply being yourself." David nodded, absorbing her words. He could feel the wisdom in them, the hard-earned knowledge that came from a life lived with purpose. Leah's strength wasn't just physical, it was the kind of resilience that came from facing the world with grace, from enduring hardship without letting it define you. He felt the urge to open up, to share a part of himself that he had kept hidden, even from those closest to him. "When I was younger," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "I faced a lot of rejection, too. People didn't believe in me, thought I didn't belong. And I think I spent my whole life trying to prove them wrong, to show them I could succeed." Leah looked at him, a hint of empathy in her eyes. "And did it help? Did it make you feel like you belonged?" David hesitated, considering her question. "For a while, I thought it did. I thought that if I achieved enough, if I reached a certain level, I'd finally feel like I belonged. But now, I'm not so sure." Leah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Belonging isn't something you find in achievements or titles. It's something you find within yourself. It's knowing that you have worth, that your story matters, no matter what anyone else thinks." David felt a pang of understanding, a realization that he had spent so much of his life chasing external validation, trying to fill a void that only self-acceptance could fill. He looked at Leah, truly looked at her, and saw the quiet strength in her gaze, the resilience that came from a deep sense of self-worth. It was something he had long admired in others but had never truly found within himself. For the first time, David felt a sense of peace, a calm that settled over him like a gentle wave. Leah's words had touched him, not just because of what she had endured, but because of the courage and grace with which she had chosen to live her life. He realized that he had the power to change, to let go of the judgments and biases that had shaped him for so long. And in that moment, he felt a newfound respect for Leah, not just as a soldier, but as a person who had shown him a different way of seeing the world. "Thank you, Leah," he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for helping me see things differently." Leah smiled, a warm, genuine smile that held no judgment, no resentment. "You're welcome, David. I think that's all any of us want, really, to be seen, to be understood. And sometimes, it takes a little push, a little reminder, to open our eyes." David nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the chance to have this conversation, to bridge the gap that had once seemed insurmountable. He had come onto this plane with his mind closed, his heart hardened by years of assumptions and judgments. But Leah had shown him another way, a way rooted in empathy, understanding, and the courage to look beyond the surface. As the plane was reaching its destination, David felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a newfound sense of clarity that filled him with hope. He had been given a rare gift, the chance to change, to let go of his prejudices, and to embrace a perspective that was more compassionate, more inclusive. And as he looked at Leah, he knew that he would carry her words with him, a reminder of the strength it took to live with grace in a world that often sought to divide. "Maybe," he said, a soft smile touching his lips, "we all need a reminder now and then." Leah nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes. And sometimes, it's the people we least expect who remind us of what truly matters." David knew that he would leave this plane a different person, a better person, and for that, he was endlessly grateful. As the plane's wheels touched down with a gentle thud, Leah and David both felt a quiet reverence settle between them. The shared experience had changed them both, subtly but undeniably, leaving them with the feeling that the world might look just a little bit different when they left the plane. Leah glanced at David, her eyes softened by understanding, and saw that he, too, seemed caught in the moment, as though he were absorbing the weight of everything they had shared. Neither of them spoke as the plane taxied to the gate, each reflecting on the conversation that had transformed the long flight into something profound. The other passengers began unbuckling their seat belts, stretching and reaching for their bags with an ease and energy Leah envied. After months on deployment, with nerves constantly stretched tight and a sense of vigilance she couldn't easily shake, even this simple act of reaching for her belongings felt like a kind of release, a reminder that she was finally, fully, home. Yet, this journey home had become something more, a reunion not just with the familiar comforts of her life, but with a sense of peace and validation that was rarer and more precious than anything she could touch or hold. As Leah retrieved her duffel bag from the overhead compartment, David remained seated, watching her with an expression that was both contemplative and grateful. Leah could see that he wanted to say something, that he was searching for the right words to capture the shift in his perspective, the gratitude he felt. But she had already seen it in his eyes, in the way he had softened, listened, and ultimately understood. When she turned to face him, David met her gaze, his eyes sincere and full of humility. He took a steadying breath, his words tentative but heartfelt. "Leah, I don't think I can thank you enough for today. You've given me something to think about, something I hadn't realized I was missing. Your words, your story. They've reminded me of things I should never have forgotten." Leah's lips curved into a gentle smile, one that spoke of understanding and acceptance. "You don't need to thank me, David. I'm just glad you listened. Sometimes, that's all it takes." Her voice was calm but laced with a warmth that underscored the sincerity of her words. She hadn't come into this conversation expecting gratitude or validation, she had simply hoped to be heard. And in that small but meaningful way, she felt a sense of peace. David looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the edges of his carry-on. "It's funny," he admitted, a soft, self-conscious chuckle escaping his lips. "I've spent my whole life thinking I knew what respect looked like, what it meant to be dignified, to have standards. And now..." He shook his head, as though marveling at the simplicity and truth of the realization that had taken root in his heart. "Now, I realize it's about so much more. It's about listening, about seeing people for who they really are, not who we assume them to be." Leah nodded, her heart warmed by his reflection. She could see that this wasn't just a surface-level shift, David's words carried a weight that suggested he was genuinely committed to this change, that he wanted to carry it forward beyond this moment. She knew, too, that this was only the beginning, that there would be moments in his life when he'd need to confront his old habits and remind himself of what he'd learned today. But the seed had been planted, and Leah could feel a sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride in knowing she had been a part of it. They stood together in the aisle as the other passengers filed out, each lingering for a moment longer than necessary. As though neither wanted to be the first to walk away from this shared experience. Finally, Leah took a breath and held out her hand. "It was good to meet you, David," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "Thank you for sharing this journey with me." David looked down at her hand, then reached out to clasp it with both of his, holding on just a bit longer than a typical handshake. "No, Leah," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing your story. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed." They released hands, and Leah turned to leave, her heart full but steady, her mind already shifting to the familiar sights and sounds that awaited her outside the plane. But before she could take a step forward, David spoke again, his tone hesitant but determined. "Leah, one last thing." She turned back to him, her gaze questioning. "Of course," she said softly. "If it's not too much to ask," David began, searching for the right words, "I'd like to tell your story. Not exactly as mine to own, but to share what you taught me, the way it opened my eyes. I think there are people in my life, people who, like me, might not realize they need to hear this." Leah studied him for a moment, a hint of surprise flickering in her expression. She hadn't expected that. But seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet resolve that had replaced his earlier discomfort, she nodded. "I think that would be a good thing, David. We all have stories that need to be told, and if sharing mine can help others understand, then yes. I'd be honored." David's face broke into a small but genuine smile, a warmth that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Leah. Truly. I promise to do it justice." With a final nod, Leah turned and began to make her way down the aisle, feeling the weight of David's words settle over her like a gentle reassurance. There was something deeply comforting in knowing that her story would live on beyond this moment, that David would carry a part of her experience into the world and use it to inspire understanding in others. As she stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Leah felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a quiet certainty that she had made a difference, however small. Outside the terminal, Leah inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs with a sense of homecoming she hadn't anticipated. She let the sounds of the city wash over her, grounding her in the familiar rhythm of life beyond deployment. She was free now, free to walk her own path, free to reconnect with her loved ones, free to rediscover the things she had left behind in her pursuit of duty and honor. As she made her way through the airport, a memory surfaced, one that felt both comforting and bittersweet. She remembered a conversation with her mother before her first deployment, a conversation that had anchored her through the toughest moments of her military career. Her mother had said, "Leah, remember that strength isn't just about facing what's in front of you. Sometimes, real strength is about understanding people, about showing them the kindness they never expected. You're going to meet people who will never see your worth, who may even try to take it from you. But remember, no one can take away the strength inside of you. That belongs to you alone." Leah had carried those words with her, returning to them like a lifeline whenever the weight of her journey threatened to overwhelm her. Today, those words felt truer than ever. She had met someone who hadn't seen her worth, someone who had tried, in his own subtle way, to diminish her right to be where she was. But instead of letting his judgment define her, Leah had chosen to extend kindness, to reach out with understanding. And in doing so, she had found not only a way to touch his heart but to reaffirm her own strength, her own purpose. A sense of peace settled over her as she exited the terminal, stepping into the sunlight that bathed the city in a golden glow. Leah had always known that the journey she was on was not an easy one. She had always understood that there would be days when the world felt too heavy, too resistant to change. But today, she had seen a glimpse of the impact one act of understanding could have, a reminder that sometimes, even the smallest shifts could create ripples that reached far beyond what she could see. As she walked toward the row of waiting taxis, Leah's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced down and saw a message from her younger sister, "Can't wait to see you. We're all so proud of you, Leah. Mom says there's a feast waiting for you at home. Drive safe and hurry." A smile spread across her face as she typed a quick response, her heart warming at the thought of being surrounded by her family, by the people who knew her beyond her rank and uniform. Leah slipped her phone back into her pocket, feeling the anticipation build as she hailed a cab. She was ready to go home, to reconnect with the people who had been her anchor through all the storms. Her mind drifted to David, to the journey they had shared, and to the quiet, unspoken bond that had formed between them. She hoped he would carry the lessons he had learned today, that he would continue to question, to grow, to see others with the compassion and understanding he had shown her by the end of their journey, and though she knew she might never see him again, Leah felt a sense of closure, a certainty that their encounter had served its purpose. She had touched his life, and he had, in his own way, reminded her of the power of her own story, of the strength she carried not only as a soldier but as a person who had learned to navigate the world with grace. As the cab rolled onward toward home, Leah's heart swelled with a quiet gratitude, for the journey, for the strength she had found within herself, and for the small but meaningful difference she had made in the life of a stranger. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle hum of the city lull her into a peaceful calm, feeling, for the first time in a long while, truly at home.